Okay. Recently, actually just yesterday, Let's Get Real with Stephen Jones put out an interview with Sage. Oh dear, what's her last name? Anyway, a very insightful and kind woman who's co-authored a book about healing from sexual abuse. So, I warn you, if you didn't already see from whatever thumbnail I'm going to put to this, I warn you, you don't have to listen to this if this is going to be too much. So, it grabbed my attention. And she said basically everybody is affected one way or another by sexual abuse. Either you've experienced it. She cited not a statistic, and I think this is important. Not a statistic, but an estimate by some, I don't remember what organization, of some very high numbers of people that they expect to experience some kind of sexual abuse. And those that don't experience it probably know somebody who has. So it caught my attention because I have experienced a couple of instances in my life that, under the right circumstances, I feel like I can call them abuse. The first one was like the thing is they weren't violent, either of them, alright? So I recognize right at the outset that there are different varieties, different ways that this can happen, different shades and gradations and varieties. How many times have I said that word now? Of sexual abuse, and it can be like an assault or it can be something else. And what I experienced when I was young was, I don't know, like casual. When I was maybe 8 years old, it's hard for me to be specific about the details because for years I would squish the memory down and I was afraid of it and I didn't want to confront it. For years I lived with this deep, dark fear that I had violated the law of chastity when I was very little, before I went through puberty, before I understood what sex meant, before I had the real, before puberty and that surge of testosterone kicked in, when I was still very ignorant about sex or how it worked or anything. All I knew was that there were private parts, right? And that it was indecent and you shouldn't look at other people's and you shouldn't touch other people's or let other people touch yours. And there was a girl who was about my age, and we were out she was over at our house because their family and ours were friends, and their family and ours remained friends for as long as we both lived in that area. And one day we were out in the backyard and she started cajoling, pleading with me to let me, allow her to play with our private parts because it felt good. And I was saying, no, I know that's something I shouldn't do, and she kept on begging and insisting, and I gave in. And it's hard for me to reconstruct. I haven't cared to really I'm really wary of going to some kind of repressed memory therapist. Oh boy, I'm not inclined to trust a therapist who is going to purport to offer to help me unearth a repressed memory, knowing full well what has happened from that kind of thing in in the past. And this isn't a forgotten or buried memory, it's a half-remembered, it's a murky memory. And I also am aware of how memories can be distorted over time. And so at my age, thinking back on this, I could reasonably doubt whether it happened as I remember it, maybe even as whether it happened at all. The thing is, I remember there's some touchstone moments when I was in my 20s and when I was maybe 10, where I thought back to this experience. It was a traumatic experience. We got caught, this girl and I, and the grown-ups were scandalized at what we were doing. And it was one of those things that just was not ever talked about ever after that. It was just not brought up. It was such a shock and a horrible thing. So, part of it's important to separate out our individual experiences in our families with the family dynamic, the local cultures in that dynamic, and something like, say, religious programming or the church, right? I could talk about, I was raised as a Mormon and I was taught with this shame about sex. Listen, motherfuckers, if I were wanting to break free from religious programming about sex, you know what? I should have welcomed this experience with the neighbor girl under that tree as the first lesson in my sexual awakening. I should have welcomed this as a liberation. I should be like Samuel R. Delaney saying that when he came across the building superintendent masturbating in the cellar when he was 6 years old, that he took that as part of his proper and thoroughly allowable and not at all shameful sexual awakening, and that maybe every child should have such a sexual awakening. Alright, had to get that off my chest. But I mean it. I get pissed off when I hear people talk about breaking free from religious repression about your sexuality, man. Because that wasn't the only experience I had. But getting back to this experience here when I was about 8. I had been baptized. I thought back on it. I had a moment when I was about 22 that I thought back on this experience, because I thought, oh my gosh, have I gone through the temple and served the mission and everything with this unrepented of sin of breaking the law of chastity, because I'd been baptized and I had engaged in this act, and so the imperfect understandings and apprehensions about what the law of chastity means and what it means to break it, that have as much or more to do with the local culture and the family dynamic and things as they do with the doctrine and its purity, which the church is trying to get its members to understand. But oh boy, human beings are lazy and stupid and don't always bother to investigate and fully understand the truth. And so there came a time when I was thinking through this. I'd bring it out sometimes and I'd kind of look at it and I'd just be fearful, and I thought, I don't know. I did that, but but I did it because she was begging me to do it. And finally, when I was maybe about 40 years old, I finally looked at it again, and I thought, I don't know if I understood quite in the terms I'm going to say, but it's kind of a more refinement of understanding now. We have fear responses. We have fight or flight responses, which is kind of, the way that people kind of water things down and simplify things, fight or flight. And I take as better understanding to say that there are at least 4 fear responses, and I think 4 is a pretty good higher resolution kind of, stable basis of understanding how we can respond to fear. We can fight, we can flee, or we can freeze, or we can fawn. And I didn't have much of a concept when I was in my 20s, or until recently. I sure didn't have that much of a concept or an understanding of myself and my own fear responses when I was 8. That I was in a situation where my responses were to freeze and maybe fawn. I'm not sure if it was a freeze or fawn. Maybe it was kind of a fawn response, that I gave in to cajoling and wheedling. And so, because I reached the age of accountability, I, consented and I committed this sin. I came to the point where I realized, no, I didn't consent and commit a positive sexual sin. I gave in to this coercion, and that was a violation. It was kind of like a casual abuse. I don't think that she really had much of a concept of what she was doing, and I have no idea whether she felt guilty about it later, whether she thought about it later, what kind of personality she had that was different than my personality, that she would do this, whereas my personality tending to be melancholic and neurotic, ruminated and brooded on this for years and years, and had it as a secret fear and pain haunting me, until I finally took this look at it later on, more recently, within the past 10 years or so, and decided, no, that was not my fault. That was not a sin on my part. I'm not counting that as a burden of a sin that I committed. That was something that was done to me. That was an abuse that was done to me. And it wasn't a violent abuse. I wasn't assaulted. I wasn't held down. I wasn't penetrated. I wasn't forced to penetrate. I didn't have these kinds of things done to me that are done to other people. So it's a different kind, it's a different grade. So, and I haven't ever felt that I deserve to ask for as much sympathy for it, for the first basic reason that I'm a male, and so I don't, whatever I might feel about the matter, I like to think I've gotten some kind of worldly wisdom and understanding of how humanity works, that I should not expect people to have the same level of pity or sympathy towards a male who gets some sexual abuse done to him, especially not from a female. If a man had held me down and raped me, that would have been traumatic, violent trauma. That would have been something very different. So for a girl to cajole and coerce me into doing childhood, playing around with private parts, or mimicking the sex act without much efficacy and not getting very far, that's a different thing. It still has still caused me a lot of pain and fear throughout my life. And so I think it's good to bring it out into the light, and as this woman was saying on the Stephen Jones podcast. And I think it's useful to bring this kind of... I've come to deplore the term lived experience because I've seen how it's been hijacked. And I don't mean to be part of the problem. But this experience that I lived through, I have it. And I think it's useful and relevant to bring to bear to this large phenomenon and this large question of sexual abuse and all of its different forms that it can take. Had I understood that better, had I come to a better understanding, not only of the event and what it meant, and that it wasn't a sin on my part, to really come to that peaceful level of healing, that state of peace and of understanding that I didn't have to carry that feeling of guilt for it anymore. Had I come to that understanding before I was about 24 years old, then perhaps I wouldn't have had to go through the second experience, which is even a bit more iffy in me claiming it as an instance of sexual abuse. I've thought about it a lot, and I've thought, yeah, on a technicality, a woman, and I will add, and I will emphasize, a feminist, used my body for her sexual gratification without my consent for that act. And she did it in a principled feminist way, which is why I emphasize that she was a feminist, which has something to do with my evolving, my developing attitude towards feminism, having experienced that fruit thereof. This is getting into some really heavy and intimate stuff, and I'm not sure how much detail to go into regarding this second experience. Again, it happened when I was about 22, and I was in a moribund relationship that I and she both had several opportunities to end and didn't. We were both very emotionally immature. And part of my dealing with that experience was to take stock of my responsibility in the matter and to hold myself to the accountability that was mine. I put myself in the situation leading to the moment that she took advantage of me without my consent. And so I don't see the purpose or any point in trying to make out like I was the victim of some kind of crime. I don't know how often it happens that young people get themselves stupidly into these kinds of situations where something goes over a line. And once again, she, the woman, did it to me, the man, and it is different than it would have been if I, the man, had forced myself on her. It's just different. I'm sorry, it's different. And what part of the difference is that if a woman is violated, if a woman is abused, including raped, I think I'm probably right in saying we can expect that to create an effect that she will carry a fear and a distaste and a negative association with sexual acts that will maybe cause her to be afraid to engage in it with people in the future. And I feel pretty confident in supposing, based on my experience, that when it is done to a man, that's not the effect that it has. And that's why it was hard for me to recognize that as abuse, and it's still kind of difficult for me to claim it as abuse, because I kind of don't know if I should expect anybody else to take it seriously, or to think of it as a very serious example, because it wasn't violating my desire. If a man forces himself on a woman, it's like a violation of her. It's this is 2 billion years deep. The sexual mechanisms of male and female reproductive strategy and instinct and everything, all that we human beings have inherited. When a man violates that by forcing himself on a woman, he does something very, very violent against her sovereignty and her choice and her desire, and it wreaks havoc. When a woman breaks down the walls of a man's inhibitions and and disregards the boundaries that are likely constructs that the man has built up by his hang-ups and his religious programming and his moral restrictions. Again, she's not violating doing the same kind of violence against the female. She's overriding something that, again, you could say is like artificial, you know. If I were to buy into the message of liberating our sexuality from religious repression, then I should have welcomed what she did as another instance of initiation and helping me to liberate myself sexually. And that's false, and I oppose that. And so I cannot go along with people that talk this sanctimonious, this revolutionary sort of rhetoric about liberating us and our sexuality from religious constraints. If I had decided to go along with liberating my male sexuality from artificial constraints and try to be more authentic, I'm not saying that if I had really truly gone after authenticity, but if I had pursued what I apprehended as authenticity, I would be living a much different lifestyle now than I am. I wouldn't be monogamously married, that's for sure. So, all this fire and I'm out of time. But the interview on the podcast, this Stephen Jones podcast interview, is talking about the need to bring these things out into the open and add them to a conversation. So I'm not trying to be weepy and garner a lot of, I don't know, attention or something. But it is important. It is something that affects everybody. Again, sex is a biological reality that's 2 billion years deep. It underpins and shapes our existences as human beings, as embodied beings in this mortal existence. And I submit to and accept the read of 31 years ago that it's an essential part of our eternal identity and destiny as well. And in service of all that, I offer these anecdotes and reflections and rambling for what it's worth. I have no idea who's listened through to the end, and if you have, Whatever comments you want to put in the comments is fine. I'm not trying to get a lot of pity or sympathy. I'm running out of things to say, and I'm not going to allow myself to erase this even though as long as it's gone on. So, as flawed as this is, for what it's worth, thank you for listening.